Welcome to the video mini lecture on the biological model of psychopathology. Purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to the biological model, which is a very important way of explaining mental illness because it's one of the oldest and it's currently one of the most dominant ways that people think about why people have mental illness. The biological model asserts that mental illness is caused by biological factors occurring primarily in the brain. The assumptions behind this begin with the assumption that mental illness is a medical problem. People who believe in this model really don't see any difference between a physical illness and a mental illness. Now, in psychology, we like to focus on the mind, but the people who really believe in this model tend to be psychiatrists. And psychiatrists are medical doctors. They have MDs, not PhDs. And what they are probably most responsible for is managing medications that people are given for medical illnesses. And of course, medications are affecting the brain, which is the next point. They're giving medications because they believe that illnesses have specific causes in the body, and by the body, we mean the brain. And if you have an emotion, a thought, if you have an inclination to do a social behavior, the origins of that are your brain. So if there is some abnormality in your emotions, your thought, your social behaviors, people who believe in the biological model insist that that has to be coming from some abnormality in your brain. Final assumption here is that there are genetic vulnerabilities for many illnesses. So just like you could have a vulnerability genetically from family members with diabetes or heart disease or some other physical illness, they would assert that the same thing is true of mental illnesses. And so what I want you to do before you go on to the final slide where I talk about an example is think about schizophrenia. If you were going to apply this model to schizophrenia, how would you do so? And I really want you to think about this and think about the assumptions and the applications before you go on and hear my example. Let's consider the example of schizophrenia. In some ways, schizophrenia is the prototypical disorder to illustrate the biological model because it, more than perhaps any other disorder that you can possibly imagine, has the best evidence for there being a biological component. One of the places that this evidence comes from is from studies of the human brain. So with modern imagery techniques like fMRI and MRI, we can take pretty good pictures of the brain. And so for example, if you look at the human brain, you can take essentially imageries that are slices of it like represented on this blue line. And if you do that with people who have schizophrenia, and you can see on the left a person with schizophrenia, and on the right a person with a healthy brain, you can actually detect significant differences. So you'll notice that the person with schizophrenia has a lot more black represented in the brain, and essentially what that black is empty spaces. So the brains of people with schizophrenia are atrophied and smaller to a degree where it actually can be seen in some pictures like this. So the black is the indication that the brain has actually shrunk in people with schizophrenia. Another example is the genetic component. So the average person has a risk of 1%, as you see at the top of this chart here. 1%. That's the prevalence of schizophrenia. Now, what this chart represents is the risk for developing schizophrenia. And what you'll notice here is that as the chart goes downward, what's actually happening is different levels of siblings and other relations are being represented. So if you go to the level of cousins, the rate of schizophrenia doesn't really go up very much if you have a cousin with schizophrenia. As you get into closer relatives, like parents and siblings and children, it goes up considerably, many, many times. But once you get up to someone having an identical twin, and remember that an identical twin shares 100% of the genetic material with their twin, the risk goes up to 48%. And so this is much higher than just a fraternal twin that shares 50% of their genes. So there's very good evidence that there's a genetic risk to schizophrenia. So the biological model says that mental illness is like physical illness, and what's happening is something is going on in the person's genes and their brain that's causing them to act in abnormal ways.